Welcome to the Pearson Center's first webinar in 2021. We have a special discussion this evening with Landon Pearson. My name is Andrew Cardozo and I'm president of the Pearson Center. As many of you will know, the Pearson Center is a progressive think tank formed in 2013 and named after Lester B. Pearson, the Prime Minister who ushered in a lot of modern Canada between 1963 and 1965. At the Center, we address a number of social and economic issues, but our singular focus in 2020 and 2021 is COVID and beyond. How do we live with it? And how do we get past it? And how do we rebuild? Today, though, is a bit of a break from that challenging theme. Today, we have a special discussion with the Honorable Landon Pearson. Landon was a senator from 1994 to 2005. She's been a lifelong advocate for the rights of children and is the founder of the Landon Pearson Resource Center for the Study of Childhood and Children's Rights at Carleton University. Landon is, of course, also the daughter-in-law of Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson, and today we will talk about both these aspects of her life, her career to date, and LBP as he's known in the family. I'm happy to say that Landon has also been a great supporter of the Pearson Centre since our formation, and she serves as a member of our advisory board. We have a bit of a special format today. I will start the session with the conversation, and then the rest of the session will largely be moderated by two of Landon Pearson's granddaughters. Lucy Vorobej is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Waterloo, and Rachel White works in public relations and the marketing field and lives in Hamilton. At about 7:45, we will start taking questions from you, the audience. So please start your questions. Please send in your questions in the question box, and we'll aim to end right at 8 p.m. We have a lot of questions to go through today. I will ask the first question and then turn to Lucy and Rachel. I sense there's a bit of feedback, so maybe Lucy and Rachel, I just ask you to go on mute for a couple of minutes until you're speaking. That might help. So we've got a lot of ground to cover, and as I was thinking about this, we could have called this session, "This Hour Has 90 Years." Landon, let me start from the beginning and talk to you about your growing up in London, Ontario, your BA in philosophy and English at the University of Toronto. Can you share some of your reflections of that period?
Well, I think that I can start off by saying I had a very good friend named Dan Offord, who was a psychiatrist that used to be at CHEO and then in Dundas at Hamilton at the center there. It's now the Offord Center, right? He asked me once, "Why do you do what you do?" And I didn't really know the answer to that. I had never thought about why do I do what I do. But I realized that why I do what I do is because of the good luck that I had as a child. I was, born in 1938, just a year after women became persons for the purpose of being appointed to the Senate. But I was born to a father who thought I was good luck because he got his job at Labatt's the day I was born. So he always told me I was good luck. So it's quite nice to be a child and be told that you're good luck. Mm-hmm. And then my mother was an artist, and she was full of energy and funny things, and she would tell me stories and make me feel very engaged. But they were not helicopter parents. They both had very busy lives. They trusted me. They trusted me to make up my own mind about things, which I often did, and then occasionally got stopped. Anyway, it was that sense. I grew up in London in the edge of the country, so it was quite free. I had a dog. The dog and I would wander off when I was 4 or 5 and eventually return when the dog decided it was time for me to go home again. So it was that sense of growing up in economic security because he was a businessman, so he was making money even in the Depression, and emotional security and physical security that gave me, and being allowed to sort of make up my own mind and become and deal with my own problems. So if I had an issue, they were not particularly sympathetic. They would kind of say, well, you know, you go and you figure out what to do. And that was extremely helpful. And I think it's one of the things that's guided me in my work with children ever since, is that, you know, we all have problems, but problems are what help us to grow. If you don't learn how to solve your problems, then you won't grow up. Anyway, there's that kind of childhood with, you know, a nice little a small private school when I was in elementary school, with a teacher who decided every time I got bored that she'd advance me. I was only 11 when I finished grade 8. And then my parents thought I was too young to go to high school with boys, so I had to go off to Kings Hall, Compton, where the headmistress was a woman who had been a protege of my grandfather, who was a professor of mathematics at the University of Toronto. And so I was there for 3 years, and I finally then persuaded my father that I was old enough to come back and meet the boys, since I was quite interested in boys. And I came back and finished my high school at London South Collegiate Institute, who has just written a nice little piece about me in there called I think it's called the Lion something. Anyway, it's the same place. It looks exactly the same. And it was a great experience, not only because there were boys there. Then I went to the university in Toronto at Trinity, where my brother was, the older brother, not the one who painted. Behind me is the portrait of LBP that was painted by my other brother, who was a painter, Hugh Mackenzie. And the university was a very good experience. I went off to Smith College on exchange. I had a lot of my education, as I look back on it now, was I had mentors. I had women who really were models, and I had those who challenged me and who were always surprised because I was a woman, a girl or whatever. But it was that sense of Smith, of course, is a women's college, so it was being surrounded almost always by women and by strong women in my education. So I think that helped. With all of this, wasn't pre-planned. That's the way it went. And of course, at Trinity, I met my husband. And in those days, one got married very young. And so as soon as I graduated, I was 20, and he had gone off to Oxford. And then I managed to go over to England when I graduated, and within 5 months we were married, because that's what you did in those days. You got married, somewhat to everybody's, well, not always to the approval of either the father of the bride or the mother of the groom. The others, LBP and my mother, were all for it. But he, as this is the grandfather of these two girls, and he was challenging and entertaining, interesting, unique man. And you would have known him too. There was nobody quite like your grandfather. And,
he was a lovely man with a lot of great stories.
A lot of great stories. Had a wonderful sense of humor.
Yeah.
And it was often said that he had an extremely good relationship with his father. So they did a lot of work together in letters and correspondence and so on and so forth. And so we were very involved as a family, connected that way. I think Lester B really respected Jeffrey's views. And Jeffrey was very discreet. He joined the Foreign Service, so it was somewhat in the same area, but they both had this extraordinary, I think, grasp of the wider issues. And particularly when we were posted in Paris, which was our first and second posting, and it was the time of Suez, which I would say was one of the things that I remember most about, or I admire most about Lester B, because it was such a mark of who he was, the extraordinarily capable negotiator, the man who knew how to make things happen in a way that was not as aggressive or assertive, but it was really, he understood who he was dealing with. He understood the Americans. He understood the Indians who were involved. He knew the new countries that all had to be brought on board in order to make this decision about Suez, for which he got, of course, the Nobel Prize.
Right.
So that's one of the things that I admired most about him. And then my life, as a Foreign Service spouse, Foreign Service family, we lived in 4 continents, traveled around with these 5 children who had various kinds of challenges and ideas, and affected them all, as in the mother of Lucy and Rachel, who became a scholar of India because of our time in India, and the others who've picked up from their own Foreign Service background a lot of their interests. So all of my children had been extremely interested in what's going on in the wider world. And it was really only after I came back to Canada for a little while that I got old enough, because, you know, when you have 5 small children, you're pretty busy, that I became, although in India, I was very involved with children in working mothers' children. And then I came back to Canada and decided to take a master's in education so that I could argue my way through some of the educators who I think at the American International School who are making a terrible error when they tried to expel all kinds of boys and girls, but mostly boys, who'd been involved in smoking marijuana. Jeez.
Way back then. You know what? I'm going to ask Lucy to jump in here, and she has a couple of questions for you, precisely in this area that we're talking about. Yeah. Lucy, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, so really, I would like to ask you a bit more about that international experience. And you've already referenced a little bit about what happened in India, but I wondered if you could tell us a bit more about how that early experience all over the world and raising children all over the world impacted your early thinking on children's rights.
Well, it was because you saw when you're a mother with small children, you connect very easily with the people in the country in ways that the men often don't always, because there's a commonality when you meet somebody who's also carrying a small child. And so I was always in there's various postings always involved with children in one way or another, whether it was working as in India, then later, or at least before that, in Mexico. In France, it was more a question of watching what was going on in the school and watching how culture impacted on the children and so on and so forth. And so I think that international experience taught me that how widely different cultures are, how important that is in how children are perceived within the culture, but how much, in fact, the fundamentals of childhood are similar. And that children, whether they were the children of construction workers or the children of the in Mexico, it was the importance of the initial family reactions, to their basic, the important things that were necessary for them, which I've thought all through my life. It's partly what you inherit, your genes, but then it's nurturing care. And it was in all these situations where I was lived, I could see the children who were doing well were the ones who were having nurturing care and who were being given, the culture was offering them a certain amount of respect, and the opportunities were opening up for them. So that the little girls that I met in India were, in fact, even though they were from just working people, construction workers, they had all those components. And I feel strongly then that if we could give every child in the world those kinds of components, of course, we can't do much about genes, actually. Thank goodness we can't really do much about genes, but but we would be able to prevent an enormous number. We'd be able to nourish a population and prevent an enormous amount of pain and difficulty. And so that's really and to do that, I came to realize that the rights, the child is a person who has rights, and that the main thing to do is to respect the rights of the children, and then you will be able to solve a lot of the problems that they might otherwise present. The child who suffers, we know this now from all the scientific evidence, that the child who suffers adverse childhood events has a tremendous difficulty in growing up to be a constructive and productive individual. So that's why I feel that the convention, which I came to later because it didn't exist then, but I was in this case influenced by LVP because of his concern about human rights, and understood how important, with the foundation of the United Nations, the family of man, and all the things that are in the preamble to the Declaration, the Declaration of Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that recognizes and talks about the family of man. The family of man includes children. That's really what keeps me going.
So if we could go back to the convention, then in 1989, the UNCRC is ratified by eventually almost every country in the world. But I wonder then if you could offer some reflections on the disconnect we see by countries ratifying the convention and then still having laws and policies, I'm thinking spanking, for example, that exist that aren't harmonized with the CRC. So what are your reflections on why that disconnect continues to exist?
Well, I think it goes back a bit to reflections by people like Reinhold Niebuhr, who was a theologian, an American theologian. Moral man and immoral society. It's the forces of culture that tend to impede the capacity of countries to do what they commit to do. So living in the Soviet Union and knowing that they had this fantastic constitution, which of course they didn't respect, was showing so clearly the disconnect between what you say you're going to do and actually the implementation. And I think everybody ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child, except the United States. The United States is the only country that's never ratified it. Every other country in the world has ratified it. Because, of course, it looks bad not to say that your children are important. But how many countries have actually implemented it is a very small number. And well, I mean, it's not what is a small number in terms of totality. So, I mean, there is a system within the UN system. They have to appear every 5 years and say, yes, we've done this and we've done that. And we've, in order to implement. But other forces interfere. So you get armed conflict and it'll interfere. Or you get drug, or COVID. I mean, all of these national and international catastrophes interfere with the capacity to implement. So even people who have the best will in the world in certain countries get nowhere. It's a very challenging, I keep thinking about how challenging this. We've made a lot of advances. I mean, at the moment, we're kind of in a difficult situation because we're going back on a number of the things that have been happening, but we've made, as a result of the convention, there have been big advances in child survival, in health, the small children, reductions of poverty and so on. All of those were being made, and all kinds of resolutions are being made. So I don't despair about the fact that people don't say what they say, they don't do what they say they're supposed to do. But at least we now know what's wrong. That it's not right not to do certain things, not to respect children. So to build a culture of respect for children depends, makes you have to think a lot. It's not easy. It's easier to ignore them. I often think, I look back at my childhood, but I sometimes wonder how many people remember that they were children once, and if they did, perhaps, they might be a little more careful about how they behaved.
Thank you, Lucy. Do you mind if we, Senator, if we switch gears and talk about Lester B. Pearson? I'll ask Rachel to take us through this part.
Sure. So this still is a little bit in the vein of children's rights, but Pearson was very much a progressive politician and thinker, but at times you've commented that he didn't really seem to get it when it came to children's rights. Can you elaborate on that? Was there a certain mindset that affected that? Did he ever really come around to it?
Well, not in the sense that he was a man who implemented it without actually having the rhetoric. Yeah, opposite, because he was, in terms of how he interacted with children, he was wonderful. With his own children and with his grandchildren. He was absolutely like a Pied Piper. He was absolutely marvelous. So he understood and loved them and understood that, I think, but I don't ever remember him translating it into an issue on rights, because that wasn't in the discourse then. He only had, as you remember, or you may not remember because you couldn't possibly remember, but he only had one woman in his cabinet. So he was even up to scratch in terms of respect for women. But, one of the things that when the question about what I think he did that was really important, one was to establish the Royal Commission on the Status of Women. So and that was partly your great-grandmother. Quite a strong-minded woman and quite a fan of women's rights. But it didn't really translate into children's rights. I think it reflects how long it takes to begin to understand what it means to look at a child as a person with rights. Just is not, culturally, it's been difficult. It's coming, it's been difficult.
Okay, and then changing gears a little bit, I know you talked about this a little bit earlier, but can you talk about LBP as a family man and more specifically his relationship with Jeffrey, my grandfather?
Well, his relationship with Jeffrey was excellent. It was very interesting because, in fact, I think as your Aunt Hillary once said, one was Jeffrey was Lester B was a pragmatic idealist, and Jeffrey was a romantic curmudgeon. And so temperamentally, they were quite different, but intellectually, their ideas were extremely similar. They flowed back and forth. So when you read the letters that they exchange and so on, you realize that they're absolutely on the same wavelength. And that was why I think LBP took your grandfather's advice quite often, which was given in a very discreet way, because Jeffrey was quite modest about that. He didn't really want to be known or have anyone know that that's what he was doing. But they, not only did they correspond a lot, but when we were living in Ottawa, they interacted a lot together, talked a lot. I don't even know sometimes what they talked about, but I think Jeffrey, your grandfather, reinforced his, because we'd had those years in France, and Jeffrey was a francophone, so he spoke well in French. I think he reinforced your grandfather's, your great grandfather's belief in the strength of national unity. Another one of the things I admire about what LVP did was to establish the Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism, which has made a huge difference in terms of how we look at the issue. And then, of course, the flag was a national unity issue. I can remember that one very well, because I can remember looking out the window from his office on Hill when the old flag was taken down and the other flag went up. And all of my children were there, including Clara's mother, who was crawling on the road. I had to lift up so she could look out the window at this great event. But it was a national unity event, the flag, and they really had to work at it. I mean, it was really challenging to get that. So there are lots of other things that he did that I thought were amazing too. When you look back at the list of accomplishments for a man who's got a minority government, it's quite amazing. I won't go into them all, but I think I mentioned the ones that I think were most important. He brought the skills of a diplomat.
My sound has cut out. Can everybody still hear?
I can hear you.
Oh, okay, I can hear you now.
Okay.
Maybe it just glitched.
I came too close.
I just had one final question, was that you yourself also had a very positive relationship with LVP and you've described him as a mentor. Can you talk about what aspects about him influenced your life in children's rights or just in general?
Well, I think that I mean, he was, we got along very well. Temperamentally, I think we clicked. He came into my life not long after he became prime minister not long after my father died. So there was probably a shift, as you know, of affection. We were both married to slightly difficult people. That can reinforce a relationship. It's, rather, he was, and he was very open. He would, talk about, a lot of it was talk about family because he really liked the family. I mean, his brothers as well as other more extended family. His children, of course, and his grandchildren. I think that was probably an anchor for him because he didn't really have many close friends. It's hard to have a close friend when you're a prime minister, to be frank. I mean, he had lots of warm acquaintances, but for him, the emotional anchor was in the family. And I think that both Jeffrey, with whom he had this really constructive relationship, and your Aunt Patsy, to whom he was devoted, helped him to keep himself balanced in times that were my mother used to say about him that he had good humor. And he did. He had an extraordinarily good-humored temperament. He did. It was very hard to upset him, and the things that did upset him tended to be ethical failures. Somebody who had been unethical. I won't give examples. This is not the right time to do that now, but there are a couple of examples I could give. He would get really upset. He hated people who lied, people who misstated the facts. He had this capacity, as he sometimes said, to see 15 sides of the story, if not just 2. And sometimes that became difficult for him because, you know, it made it sometimes difficult for him to take some of the decisions he had to take. It's not a ruthless man. It was, I think sometimes it was hard when he had to make a decision about, you know, removing somebody from cabinet.
Right.
Or of that sort, changing those kinds of things he found very difficult.
Yeah, I have a couple of questions for Rachel and Lucy, and Landon, you feel free to join as well. But Rachel, if we can just keep on the theme of Lester B. Pearson, you have been you transcribed a number of the letters that he wrote. Can you share with us some of your reflections of Lester B. Pearson?
Sure. A lot of the reflections are stuff we've actually touched on this evening. Everything, Granny, that you're saying about his personality, I very much see through all of these letters that I typed up. Family was definitely very important to him. He had a great relationship with his father and grandfather, both of whom were Methodist ministers, and passed down the importance of social justice. I think, which was just all the more underscored by his experiences during World War I, like many of his contemporaries, that he really wanted to create a better future. Another reflection is that he was always very positive and optimistic, as you said, Granny, and he believed that Canadians and people can really work through periods of profound upheaval and come out stronger in the end. I actually have this great quote from one of his letters when he was living in London, England during 1940, writing back to his wife, Marion, who was in Winnipeg at the time. So he said, "There's no use deceiving ourselves because the world over here is collapsing and victory over the Nazis can't prevent it. England will never get back to the old complacent Rolls-Royce long weekend existence of yesteryear. The last war begun this process. This one will complete it. But that doesn't depress one too much because I've never been enamored with our present social and economic organization. We can do a lot better, and as we ought to be able to build in Canada on foundations which will have escaped the physical battering they will get here, our children may become part of a far better society than we ever knew. So through all this blood and tears, we may work something out that will mean progress." Which I think is a really, really interesting quote and a mentality to keep in mind as we're going through COVID right now. I mean, it's obviously a profound period of upheaval, and, you know, hopefully there is something good that will come out of this. I mean, even look at what we're doing tonight, the way technology has adapted with these Zoom calls and the way we are able to connect, even though physically we can't be together. I know we're running a little bit short on time, so there's just a couple of short quotes that I want to bring up that speak to, again, his positivity, but also his sense of humor. So many of you may also know that he was an avid sportsman, and lots of the letters had little anecdotes about various sports teams from the time. And this one was written to Jeffrey in 1971 when he had gone to visit the Expos. And he wrote, "It was unanimous that I was the best ex-PM over 70 baseball player of all time. If I had been 10 years younger, I would have made the team, or so I was assured." And then I just have one more. So this was following the loss of his eye due to a tumor. So this was right before the end of his life. He wrote, "It was certainly a surprise to find out on coming back from Austria that what I thought was merely eye trouble was something else. Presumably this confirms what some people have always long felt, that you never really knew what was going on in my head." He goes on to say, "So all is well. True, my baseball career has been suddenly brought to an end, but as Gordon Sinclair said in his note, I can now qualify to be an umpire."
Thank you, Rachel. That's great. Kind of on that theme, and what you were saying a few minutes ago, Landon. One of the Jim Coots, who worked for him, had given a speech at the time of the 50th anniversary of Pearson's taking office, and at the end of the speech, he talked about the chaos that also plagued his government, some of the ethical scandals, and sort of, Diefenbaker breathing down his neck all the time. It wasn't an easy time, but he sort of said something like, despite all the chaos, he was able to accomplish so much, but then kind of asked the question, oh, was it because of the chaos? So that while everybody else was sort of throwing bombs at each other, he sort of kept his eye on the ball and got a whole lot of things through. So do you think it was despite the chaos or because of the chaos that he was so successful?
Well, that's a very challenging question. I used to think of him in my mind as like you tack, when you're sailing and you're going against the wind. To get upstream, you have to tack back and forth in order to go forward. And I used to think that was a bit the way that he operated. That he did manage, because the one thing about him, among many things about him, was he kept his eye on the ball, so to speak. He had a clear vision of where he wanted to go, and so other things he would try to figure out how to have them, how to deal with them in sideways. But he had this tremendous personal integrity. So when he was accused, as he was sometimes, of these sort of ethical failures, these sort of the scandals that were brought up at the time, it was very upsetting to him because that was not who he was. But it was the failure to understand that if you want to get from here to there, it's never a straight path.
Yeah. Rachel's last few quotes displayed a bit of a dry sense of humor, and as I recall, Landon, that was very similar to Jeffrey's dry sense of humor. Did they have a similar sense of humor about them?
Well, Jeffrey was more of a leg puller. Jeffrey's general view is to keep you off balance.
Okay.
His jokes were rather in a way that sort of, you never quite knew what it was that he was saying. And I think that when he was in boarding school in Canada at PCS, he was known as Joker Pearson. So he was 16 or 17 at the time. And he built up this defense. I think the way he joked was a part of defense against all the separations and things that had happened during his childhood. So I think he kept up that defense quite well. But because he was so, he really was a writer, Jeffrey. He was a man of letters. His wit often extremely funny, even if it threw you off.
Yeah. Lucy, I have a question for you. Can you share with it? You have worked fairly closely with Landon on children's rights. Can you share with us your reflection on Landon's work, especially in recent years?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I could talk about, Granny, your influence on my life endlessly, but I know we only have so long. I'll just say, in the interest of time, one of the most important elements of your work that has really inspired my own approach to social justice is your ability to continually challenge the narrative about marginalized communities. And you mentioned this a bit earlier, of the stories we tell about children, the way we think about children has a profound impact on how they're treated, individually, one-on-one, but also within a society. And I think that part has been so impressive to me, because if we don't see children, I mean, often the idea is that children are the citizens of the future, that they'll be valued contributing members of society once they reach a certain age of maturity. But when we do that, we not only dismiss their rights as children, we deprive society of their insights, which I think are crucial now more than ever as we attempt to address the challenges of the 21st century. I'm thinking in particular, the one child that you brought to the UN on the conversation of the sexual exploitation of children. And it was a child's voice who said, we're not child prostitutes, as was the language of the time. We are sexually exploited children. And so just all the insights that young people can bring. So I've just been impressed by your ability to help reframe the narrative of children in Canada and to provide spaces where their rights are respected and their relationship with adults has really been fostered. So we haven't really mentioned tonight Shaking the Movers, but this workshop brings together children from across the country to discuss issues that are important to them, like discrimination, climate change, education, and has them reflect on these ideas. A report is produced that really highlights their voices and perspectives. And then that report gets sent to stakeholders and adults who not only read the report, but mechanisms are put in place in which the report is responded to and action is committed to. And the children hear that, and through that process, there's a relationship that is built. And I guess to summarize, I think I've been so impressed by how you have framed advocacy, not just as challenging marginalization, but as relationship building. And that's how we're really going to move forward together, building relationships, adults and young people, and all members of society. How do we make sure everyone in society is included so that we can move forward together in the best way possible?
Thank you.
So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We're going to carry on with this conversation a bit. We've got a few questions coming in, and I'll read them out to you, and they're all for you, Landon. But Lucy and Rachel can feel free to join in if you want to add anything. So the first one's a bit longer than the others, but it's a good one, so I'll read it out. UNICEF recently outlined multiple challenges children in Canada are facing, including mental health, obesity, and not being supported by their families. After COVID-19, how can we ensure our policies are addressing these issues?
Well, I think just like Lucy said, the first thing to do is we have to ask them. Ask them what is their view? How do they think we should be addressing them? How do we think? I think the challenge is to look at children not as problems, but as solutions. That's what the young girl said at the special session on children in New York in 2002. We are not the problem, we are the solution. And I think that to put in place far more efforts to actually enable them to take part in the discussions that lead to the decisions that are now harming them. Because I think a lot of the decisions that are being made are being harmful. And how do you balance out one impact with another? So I'd rather not look at sometimes all the negativity about, difficulties that children have, but rather say, how can we figure out, how can we talk with them and ask them how we can do this the next time, because there will be a next time. And so we need to be doing some preparation. We need to be putting in place some more opportunities to build up preparation for the next time, because obviously we came to this pandemic without being properly prepared, either generally or for how to interact with the children. And so I think that's my answer to that one.
What are your concerns these days, Landon, in terms of the schools being closed? How is that affecting children?
Well, I think it's very difficult. I think some children are benefiting. In fact, I mean, some children probably will end this whole thing with closer relationships in their families. Others will end up with much, more difficult relationships. But I think there's no question that it's impacting on education generally. I would like to see, to be frank, I'd like to have some really positive look at the school system itself and say, well, maybe we shouldn't have such big classes. Maybe it'd be better to hire more teachers. Maybe we better invest more in being more responsive to the students. Because I'm not sure that, I mean, what one tends to see is not so much what's lacking for some of the young people. One tends to see that it's their social relations that they worry about. But I haven't heard many of them actually talking so much about worrying about the quality of their education. And so I'm wondering, I think it's really a good time for school systems generally to stop for a moment. Let's look, how can we be better schools? How can we enable children to have more of an input into their own education?
Yeah. Landon, the next question, in your time abroad, did you see any best practice models for childcare and raising children? And what lessons can Canada learn from other countries?
Well, I think that, I mean, we're fortunate to be a country that has a very broad sort of, we're very varied. We have lots of variety in Canada, lots of different backgrounds and so on. I think the positive ones in many ways that I saw in my time abroad was the way in which the Indian workers that I worked with interacted with their children. It was very, very warm, very supportive. And on the whole, I was also interested. I wrote a book about children in the Soviet Union, and while one would think that everything was, not so good, there were many good things that were going on for children there that we could learn from. I think we still could learn from, which had to do with more literature. Out of Russia, I came with the idea of the Republic of Childhood. The Republic of Childhood is the world of children's literature, and the Russians produce wonderful children's literature. And even in the worst times of the Stalinist period, there were some marvelous children's literature being created.
Interesting, yeah.
So I think those kinds of things, and the focus also on play. Those are the kinds of things that I feel that we can learn from. More focus on play, more investment in children's theater, more investment in opportunities for children to engage in those kinds of activities.
Okay, I have a couple of questions for Lucy and Rachel. So the question goes as follows. It's rare to have a mentor of Landon's caliber. What is the most important thing that you have learned from your grandmother? And Rachel, there's another question for you. Were you surprised by anything you learned from the family while transcribing letters? You can pick what you want to talk about or not want to talk about. But so,
well,
Rachel, go first.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Now I'm unmuted. I'll just say, so these letters I actually typed up over a decade ago, and at the time I actually didn't realize about my great-grandfather's glass eye. I didn't realize that he had lost that, so that was something interesting that I stumbled upon. In terms of the impact my grandmother has had for me, I would say and this even trickles over to both my grandfather Jeffrey and LBP, is seeing my family being movers and shakers globally and in Canada. I've always really been able to see myself in history and seeing the role that an individual can play, and you know, we're not just passive observers. And you know, with the Convention on the Rights of the Child, that was always something that was talked about a lot in my family and my household growing up. And I was very aware that as a child, I have rights, and I'm not sure that's true for everyone.
Okay, thanks. Lucy?
Yeah, I would just echo what Rachel said, and to say, I think my horizons with you as my grandmother have been limitless when I was a child and continuing. So being a young girl, a young woman, and seeing a woman being so actively engaged in the world and working to construct a better world and a world that she wanted to see. I never felt limited by my gender, or, you know, you talked about people being surprised that you were doing well and you were a woman. And I have been lucky enough not to really encounter that in my life. So knowing that my options were limitless, and it's an amazing thing, Rachel said, to have a child's rights advocate as your grandmother. I will never forget the value of feeling heard my entire life. And that's something I wish every child would experience.
Thank you both. A couple of questions back to you, Landon. The first one is regarding Lester B. Pearson. What drove Lester B. Pearson's interest in Medicare? And if I can just add on, aren't we grateful today, given COVID, that we have Medicare from way back then?
Oh, wow. I mean, aren't we? Particularly when we look south of the border.
Yeah.
I think he was a man. He had a very strong social justice streak, and I think he felt. I think his experience in the First World War, which he started off as a medical orderly, actually, in Greece, in that sort of part, it gave him some vision of what was going on in terms of health. I think it was just generally a sense of fairness that he probably knew. I don't know, because I don't really remember in this, but he must have known people who'd been sort of destroyed by medical bills and so on and so forth in the time before Medicare. And I think Tommy Douglas had a big impact on him. He really respected Tommy Douglas, and I think he thought that just thought this was a good idea. And I think some of the people that were in his in the PMO were that worked with him were very keen to move in that direction. I'm trying to remember the names, Tom. Anyway. So I think it was something that was natural to him to think that it was fair, you know, that in order to avoid the kinds of things that he would have seen during the 1930s, for example, of tragedies of people who couldn't afford things. So I think it came out of his natural instinct for social justice. That was very much part of the 60s too. I mean, the 60s in the United States was much more, should I say, there was more activity. In Canada, it was more muted, but it was the same forces were pushing, I think, for greater justice. We were just lucky that we managed to get further ahead on that scheme than they could south of the border.
Yeah, that was Tom Kent you were talking about, was it?
That's right.
Yeah. A question on the flag debate. You mentioned that he was a bit of a quiet-mannered man, but taking on the flag debate wasn't exactly a mild-mannered approach or issue. And I recall that he started off with a speech in Winnipeg to the Royal Canadian Legion, was roundly booed and yelled at in that hall. Did he know what he was taking on when he started that fight?
Oh, I expect he did. But he did, as my mother said, he did have this epic good humor. It was hard to really, I mean, he didn't take things personally very often. So if he had an idea that he really wanted to pursue, and this was the idea that he really wanted to pursue, because he could see it, the importance it was for both for the growth of the nation and for national unity. I think that was, you know, there was 6 months of debate in the House and all kinds of attacks and so on and so forth. But he just was convinced that it was the right thing to do. And enough people around him were also convinced that it was the right thing to do. So now we weren't here when that was most of the debate was going on. We were living in Mexico at the time, but it was, I know it was, I think Marion got more upset than he did at the attacks on him.
Yeah, yeah.
Took that more personally.
Oh yeah, interesting. Well, it's interesting because from what I understand, Diefenbaker was totally opposed to the flag change through that debate. But to his credit, he
was their backgrounds were different. He was Lester B came out of diplomacy, and Diefenbaker was a prosecutor. Those are two very different professional formations, which is why they often went just, you know.
Yeah, yeah. But interestingly, I read that at the end of the day, at the end of the whole thing, both Diefenbaker and Pearson went to Buckingham Palace when the Queen signed the royal proclamation of the new flag. So he did come around at the end, or at least was prepared to live with the new flag. One more question here for you, Landon, as we wrap up. What is the most important lesson we can learn from children?
Hope. I think children look forward and not back. There's lots of important, I mean, it's hard to say what's the most important thing. I mean, every child that I've ever known has changed me in some way. My own children certainly changed me. My grandchildren have changed me. I'm watching Carl, now my great grandson, beginning to change me, and it's because they're, you know, they embody hope. That every child is a new chance for the whole human race. It's my profound belief.
Yeah,
but,
yeah.
Yeah, but in order to be that kind of chance, you have to recognize them as persons who, with agency, and protect, respect, fulfill their rights.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Lucy Vorobej and Rachel White, for being part of this. The Honorable Landon Pearson, thank you for being here today and sharing this with us. Thank you for your support for the Pearson Centre and your involvement, but most of all, thank you for your ongoing service to Canadians and your dedication to children's rights. As your granddaughters are inspired, I think many of us who are watching this today will be very inspired by what you've had to say, but also what you have done through your life and continued to do through your life at this halfway mark of your career. Happy birthday for your 90th. And thank you for being part of this. For our audience, I just want to remind you the next couple of webinars, we have one next week on January the 20th with 3 former premiers on the big challenges facing Canada. We'll be talking to Dalton McGuinty, Christy Clark, and Bernard Lord. And on February the 16th, we have a webinar on energy affordability, a fine topic to be thinking about in the middle of winter. So with that, thank you, everybody. Thank you and stay safe. And again, Landon Pearson, thank you very much for being here this evening.
Oh, thank you, Andrew, for making this possible. And thank you, Lucy and Rachel, for being so, I don't know, being such wonderful people as you are. Thank you.
Thank you.